Hi, this is Steve Matteo at WUSB along with Trevor Christian. And our guest today is Vanessa Otero. She is the creator of the Media Bias Chart and the founder and CEO of Ad Fontes Media. She's a former patent attorney in Denver, Colorado. She holds a BA in English from UCLA and a JD from the University of Denver and is on the advisory council of Media Literacy Now. Vanessa, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, for people who don't know what Ad Fontes Media is, maybe you could just explain it in a concise sort of nutshell so people understand what it is and what your charter is and what you're looking to do with this organization that has been around since 2018.
Yeah, we rate the news. We rate the news for reliability and political bias, specifically left to right political bias. And we're best known for an infographic called the Media Bias Chart. I created the first version of that chart in 2016, founded the company a couple of years later. It's a two-dimensional infographic that shows the reliability of news sources from top to bottom and a horizontal axis from left to right. So various versions of that are popular on the internet, and we are a company that provides fundamentally our data to stakeholders in the media ecosystem.
Okay. And so, why did you decide to do this? What was the impetus for, first of all, creating the chart?
Great question. Sometimes I ask myself that every day because I in the run up to the election in 2016, I noticed that my friends and family were fighting in really unproductive ways on Facebook. In particular, that was like the hot thing to do back then, is like argue with your family on Facebook about politics. It's not so much anymore, but people would use really unreliable and biased news sources to make their point, and they end up not convincing each other, but fighting with each other and unfriending each other. So I wanted to just talk to my friends and family about how some news sources are good, some news sources are okay, some news sources are not so great. And it's fine for sources to be left and right. I mean, we can have our differing political viewpoints, but there are some sources that are just way extreme, way out there. So to be able to tell the difference between those is important. So as a hobby, I put it on. I tinkered with making a little infographic to talk to my friends and family about it, and it went viral. And it just sort of took on a life of its own.
Okay. Now, obviously, because we are not television, we cannot show this. But I'm looking at one of the charts because there are many, but there is one that you will provide on your website to anybody that they can see it.
Hmm.
And essentially, I'll just see if I can explain this. The graph pretty much has a top, a side, and a bottom, and that's the three sort of criteria. So would that be visually, if you're looking at it, is that a good way to explain it? And could you explain it without going through each one?
Sure.
Could you sort of explain that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a vertical axis for reliability. So from top to bottom, the stuff that's most fact dense, the work that journalists do is at very top, fact reporting and analysis. In the middle is stuff that's opinion and analysis, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. There's opinion and analysis are important to our discourse, but it's important to distinguish it from fact reporting news. And then below that, on the vertical axis, are things that are problematic, like they're not outright misleading or false, but they are maybe selective, incomplete, unfair, things in that gray area. And there's a lot of things in our media discourse that fall into that section. And then below that, there are things that are misleading or are false or inaccurate. And then from the horizontal axis is left to right. There's things that are in the middle and things that middle is not necessarily best. Middle is just middle. And things can fall there because either they're centrist, which is a bias, or they are minimally biased, or they show a balance of one or more sides. Again, that's not necessarily the best. It's just those are the things that can make it fall in the middle. And then as you go out, there's skews left and right, strong left and right, hyperpartisan left and right, and then most extreme left and right. So it's basically two axes and it's multiple categories.
So who would use this? What would be the benefit to them? And I imagine there'd be different kinds of people or groups even. So who uses it and why?
Oh, everybody that needs to navigate the news landscape. I mean, it used to be many years ago, some of us remember, where there was a handful of network broadcast news outlets, and there were, maybe a few dozen local newspapers and national newspapers. But now there's tens of thousands of news sources. So it's individual news consumers that come to our site every day to just look up on our interactive media bias chart where a news source is. A lot of educators use this, so high school, college instructors to teach media literacy, the big user base of ours. But then in the folks that actually are in the media industry, there are the news publishers themselves, the advertisers that place their ads on news sources. There's social media companies, researchers, uh, all those types of folks end up using our information to help navigate the news landscape.
So why hasn't someone done this sooner than you?
Good question. It's hard. There's a lot of news out there. And when I first started, one thing that alarmed me and made me really take this seriously as a business was that first version, when it was just me by myself, I, I am a biased human. I have my own like limitations. I can only, look at and analyze so many news sources myself. But textbook publishers asked if they could print this in their textbook, and how much would the copyright fee be? And at first, I was like, "Are you sure you want to do that? Like, I'm just some lady, you know." It's not very academically rigorous. The reason why was because there wasn't anything out there like this, and it conveyed a lot of information in a compact format with enough nuance that you can like dive in a little bit further. And so over the that made me uh, that made me really think about what would it take to really make this academically rigorous. And I knew it would take refined methodology, repeatable, lots of other analysts on my team. And now it is, cited in lots of academic publications and a lot of data points.
Can you describe to me just we are on radio. People may be looking at the chart. They may just as likely be driving or something like that.
Hmm.
Can you describe to me the shape the chart takes, why it takes sort of like that rainbow shape, and
Yeah.
if there's a strong correlation between being a centrist or non-biased news source and being reliable?
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of observers looking at the chart will say, well, like the overall shape sort of resembles like an inverted V, where there's a lot in the top middle, and then as you go out to the right and left, there's a strong correlation with lower reliability. And the thing to, th this graph is not a normal distribution graph. That's not, even though it evokes the shape of a bell curve. It's not like what they call in statistics a normal distribution graph. These are two axes of reliability axis and a horizontal bias axis. And these are strongly related but still independent factors, variables. So there is, if you look at the things that are in the middle of the chart, I said before that middle is not necessarily best. And a lot of things can fall in the middle, even if they're not reliable. So the best way to see that is if you look at the bottom middle of the chart, there are news sources that are either apolitical and they publish false information. One that's sort of well known, that's gone in and out of existence over the years, is the National Enquirer. It's a little bit right biased, but not too strongly. There are podcasts like Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan he has right-leaning guests, he has left-leaning guests, he has high reliability guests, low reliability guests. But when you take the range of all the different podcasts, it shakes out somewhat towards the middle, but generally because of several unreliable guests, that reliability score is low. So it's not like a and there's a strong but not perfect correlation between things that are very highly biased and things that are lower in reliability. Now you can be out pretty strong to the left and right and still be highly factual. You present just all the facts on your side, but they just because of the topic selection and what you choose to focus on and what you choose to not include, that can contribute to like some appropriate bias to the left and to the right. But you also have things that are in that very same, right and left um, category that are much lower in reliability. Like instead of using facts to support their statements, it's a ton of opinion, name calling, even things like that. So strong but imperfect correlation.
So you sort of alluded to kind of an example that I wanted to bring up.
Hmm.
And I'm just going to use this is a very random one. I'm not picking
Sure.
on these folks or anything, but
Hmm.
I mean the Wall Street Journal. I think anybody that's in the media
Hmm.
would say, in terms of their news, it's robust. There's no question about it. It's
Hmm.
excellent reporting. They've been around since the beginning of time. I don't think anybody would doubt it. It's not just financial news, obviously,
Hmm.
but the opinion page is completely different. It's a
Hmm.
it's a totally different animal.
Hmm.
It's like a different person living with a family almost. You have this family,
Hmm.
and then you have this other person who lives up in the attic. And I know maybe I'm being a little flippant here, but so what my question is, I'm not looking to poke holes at them or make a joke. Is
Sure.
so how do you evaluate an organization like that who their news is so different in terms of bias and news value? And I understand one is news and one is opinion,
Hmm.
but so how do you rank then the Wall Street Journal themselves? And I'm just using them as an example
Yeah.
because I think it's very illustrative of the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. Well, what's helpful to visualize this is if you go to our website, we have an interactive media bias chart. And if you pull up the Wall Street Journal or you pull up anything like the New York Times, what you'll see is an overall placement of the logo on the chart. But then you'll see a scatter plot of dots behind it. And the overall news source is a weighted average of all those dots. All those dots are articles that we've rated individually. And so to rate an overall news source, we have to get a representative sample of their content. For online sites, it's articles. For TV shows, it's episodes. And a representative sample it will really show you overall what are they publishing? Like what are they publishing more of, less of, etc. And the distributions across each type of news outlet are really different. Like you can even see the difference between like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Um, We've rated hundreds of articles from the Wall Street Journal. So you'll see in that scatter plot a bunch of dots that are like top middle of the chart, and those would be their fact reporting articles. And then you'll see a bunch of dots over to the right and a little bit lower in the opinion area of our chart because we're evaluating articles individually. Each article that we show on that chart has been rated according to our content analysis methodology by a panel of three of our analysts, three out of our 60 analysts. So we have on that panel one left, one right, one center every time we do one of these evaluations of an article. And, you know, the the Wall Street Journal happens to clearly label their opinion section. And that was the norm for print publications, like the New York Times or Washington Post, LA Times, a lot of local news, a lot of, things that used to be in print still do that as a practice, but a lot of newer publications just don't do that at all. Like labeling, like a differentiation between a news and an opinion section is actually not all that common anymore. So you might go to an online magazine like the Atlantic or Vox or Reason, and it's a lot of analysis content. There's also fact reporting on there, but it's not necessarily labeled as one thing or another. Reason and Vox are pretty much all analysis, but none of it's labeled analysis. So it's important to be able to look at the content and make that distinction of like what is this fact reporting? Is this analysis? Is there opinion? Whether or not it's labeled. So we that's what our little dot plot shows. And then the weighted average, like New York Times, Wall Street Journal are up towards the top. One to the left, one to the right, as you can imagine. But then you've got things that like HuffPost or Breitbart have a lot more opinion content, and therefore their overall score is further to the left and further down. Then you've got like really hyper partisan, misleading content creators, and those would be like in the bottom corners. And you can see by their scatter plots behind them the frequency of type of content they publish, and that's how we evaluate it overall.
I think, unfortunately, I think what happens nowadays is when people hear the word bias, and
Hmm.
we're talking about news now. We're not talking about any other topics.
Right.
It's almost like a bad word,
Yeah.
whether you're on the right or whether you're on the left. And I
Hmm.
mean, you're treating it very much as it's almost clinical the way that you're treating it, and I don't mean that
Hmm.
negatively.
I think
So
it's a compliment.
right, so I mean, look, I'm a journalist. I've been a
Yeah.
journalist for a long time. So I mean, for me, obviously, I understand
Hmm.
what it is in an abstract way. But I
Hmm.
think, particularly since 2016, the word is whether you're on the right or the left, it is viewed in a negative way. So
Hmm.
how does that affect you and what you do, and
Hmm.
discourse that you have with people, or people trying to understand what you're about?
Yeah, I think it's a little unfortunate. We have the English language has a lot of words, but there aren't great words to distinguish between the two things I think need a distinction, which is appropriate bias versus inappropriate bias. That's really what we're looking for because we, you know, bias in terms of like having a perspective, like everyone has it. It's just a function of, it's a word that we use for a very normal and appropriate thing to represent the idea that we all come to our experiences with varying backgrounds and experiences. And you can't eliminate that, especially if any journalist writing can't eliminate that. Um, but then there's like inappropriate bias. So uh, that's the thing that we use the same word for it, bias. And when people are talking negatively about that, they usually mean like a very inappropriate bias. And there's different types of biases that are appropriate for different environments. So, we all have there are positions in society like referees and umpires or judges that their job is to be as fair as possible. Their job's not actually to be neutral. Like to make that finer distinction, neutral is like a mediator. Like the fair is a judge. You're asking the judge. A mediator just says, "All right, you two hash it out. I'm just going to help you, come to your agreement." A judge has to be fair, and they have to make a call on like what is right or what is wrong. Umpire has to do the exact same thing. So we expect a fact reporting journalist to be fair like that. So the appropriate level of bias would be like, as long as you're not going like overboard with your characterizations, your adjectives, your advocacy, like your selectivity, then that's okay. You keep it within this like middle range of like appropriate bias. But when you're talking to a podcast host, somebody who's like, they are somebody on an opinion page, somebody who wants to just talk, make an argument for something, you expect like more of their opinion, their perspective, and that can be appropriate in that situation too. What's widely not appropriate is like even in opinion when you're like name calling or you dehumanizing or vilifying people or saying false things. Most of us view that as an inappropriate level of bias, whether it's news or opinion.
Okay. Well, speaking of news and opinion, you're listening to WUSB. I'm Steve Matteo, and we're here with Trevor Christian. Our guest is Vanessa Otero. She's the creator of the Media Bias Chart and the founder and CEO of Ad Fontes Media.
So, Vanessa, can you address the notion that, quote unquote, the news media has a liberal bias? Because I know that a lot of surveys of individual journalists will show that they primarily lean towards the left.
Hmm.
How does that translate into actual coverage and the left wing of your chart and the right wing of your chart? How do they compare in terms of reliability and density in
Hmm.
certain areas further or closer to the center?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's so many, considerations. The field, there are certain fields that do tend to lean left, like journalism, academia, like as there are fields that lean right, finance, or energy, and that's there are a lot of reasons for that in the United States, and the effect of that, especially starting in the late 80s and 90s, when Fox News it came onto the scene, like cable news really broke on to the scene. A main complaint, a void that Fox tried to fill, was the complaint that these other existing news outlets, like the main broadcast networks, the main newspapers, did have a left-leaning bias. And so the response was to have like more overtly conservative news in response. And so that's like really evolved a lot over the last, 30 years, 30, 40 years. But you do see on our chart a lot of really large print publications uh, and large like media organizations that have been around a long time do lean a little bit left. And especially when their opinion content leans mostly left, the newsroom will also tend to lean left. This is like one of the main complaints about like NPR and PBS, like recently on Capitol Hill, and even by one of their own former editors, was that like most of the folks, most of the opinion content is left, and that's hard for that to not creep into the newsroom. So you'll see that like news outlets where their opinion content is on the right, their news outlet content is also a little bit on the right. It's just hard for them, as much as you try to have a barrier between like the opinion writers and the fact reporting writers, it just sort of bleeds over. So there is a very high density of what's called, people will refer to as mainstream media that's just a little left of center. Not a lot, but a little. And I think what's broad brushes about like the right leaning and or right wing media is that because mainstream media has had a lot of power historically to choose what's being covered. um, they like right-wing media producers maybe felt a responsibility to like push back harder and like be more overt advocates for right-leaning, right-wing points of view. And so there is a very high concentration of like opinion content on the right and lower reliability content on the right. And there's not as high of a concentration, especially on the web, that's like really left wing and really unreliable. And I want to caution people about like using that to justify their side and like be righteous about it, because you can have like post hoc reasoning for like why this proves that your side is correct, I mean, if you're getting your confirmation bias, if you're left leaning and you're getting all your confirmation bias from like a reliable news source, like you don't really have a need for a less reliable one. If you're not getting, if you feel like you're not getting a fair shake on the right from mainstream media news sources, you might be, more open to like really overtly political, opinionated content on the right.
So, to follow up Trevor's serious question that you answered excellently, Stephen Colbert has said on many occasions that the truth tends to have a liberal bias. So I would love to just, without editorializing, I would love to just get your take on that.
Yeah, I don't think that phrase has had a very like has been very effective on convincing folks on the right to, to the left leaners' point of view, you know. It's making fun of people tends to not have be very effective as a means of persuasion. When you it's like satisfying for folks on the left to say that, and like it sort of I think it sort of cuts off any further inquiry, you know? You're just saying, well, I'm on the side of truth. I don't even need to consider like your perspective or why you disagree. You're just flat out wrong, and we just need to defeat you, you know? That we kind of see where that's gotten us as a country. And I'm much I tend not to be so like flippant about dismissing yeah, one side or the other.
Right. I mean, I think
I'm
he's
no
making
fun here.
right.
So
No. I mean, I think he's making a joke, and
yeah.
there is a kernel of truth perhaps in it. And it one of the things you learn, right away as a journalist, and this explanation has changed over the years, is if you're anchoring a show and one person says it's raining and the other
Hmm.
person says it's sunny out,
Hmm.
that your job is not to put both of those people on and have them
Hmm.
debate it. Your job is to look outside the window.
Hmm.
So how does that fit in to this sort of this thread we're on right now?
Yeah, um, it, it's a great point. Like just because there are two sides to things doesn't mean the two sides are equal and opposite, or they're both equally correct. So sometimes I get reporters that are just like exasperated because we'll say, this article has a left-leaning bias, and they're like, well, what do you want me to do? Just like find somebody who's wrong and like just both sides it and like have a like false balance. And that's not what we're saying at all. Like you can tell one way to try to like be in the middle and like uh and be fair is to try to get both sides of a story and have like this equal balance, but the um they're not always equal on both sides. So what the reporter can best do is surface as many facts as possible. Like make the case with more facts. Rather than like more like comments from one person on what they think and a comment from another person on what they think. Those aren't facts. Those are people's opinions about stuff. When you're getting a quote from an expert, like the more facts you can bring in, like the higher the reliability is and the less likely it is to be biased.
Is there, by any chance, a relation, at least among right-leaning sources, that you see between conservative-leaning but and not necessarily pro-Trump and more pro-Trump sources? Is there a distinction between those two categories in terms of factuality?
Well, on the right, the right has shifted a lot in the last, 10 years since, before Trump's first election. And like what it means to be we use right and left because those are really broad terms, they're the broadest. It encompasses in America Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative, but it's not a binary. Left and right is not a binary. It's definitely a gradient. And so you have, on the right, you've got folks that, before Trump, would all call themselves conservative and they would align on certain like policy positions like taxes and guns and immigration and abortion and, rights for LGBT people, et cetera. So, but after Trump, like, and when Trump came on the scene, there was this, faction of, never Trumpers, and over the years, like that, coalition of folks who, dislike Trump, who's the leader of the Republican Party, um, it has really is morphed, and you've got folks that are they would call themselves conservative because they still align with those conservative principles, like on abortion and taxes and size of government and guns, etc. But they dislike Trump sometimes for or disagree with Trump sometimes for very conservative reasons, like uh, flouting of the rule of law, or like overreach of executive power, or just sheer like you know um, lack of respect for like tradition and uh like comporting yourself with like a lot of dignity. So there's when we classify something as right, like a piece of content, we're usually one piece of content is only about a couple of issues, like one, two, or three issues at the most. So we're looking at how that piece treats that topic, treats that, like if the article is about immigration, how right or left is it on that? If the article is about Trump, how right or left is it on that? Like those are all separate issues, and we try to just evaluate it issue by issue and person by person.
So, a little follow-up to that. Would you suggest that the transformation of how the political parties behaves has transformed whether or not a newspaper could be considered left or right, even if that newspaper hasn't done anything to waver from its original values?
That's a good question. Do you have any examples in mind?
Um,
I mean, I
like let's say something as straight across as the AP or Reuters.
hmm
Would it be considered perhaps more left-leaning today than it would have 10, 15 years ago, just by virtue of the fact that uh, sort of the
hmm
institutional respect for democracy sort of thing has
hmm
become more of a polarized issue,
hmm
straight up the middle
hmm
reporting based on the notion that democracy is good.
hmm
I don't know if I'm choosing the right news source, but is it, would your, I guess I'm trying to ask, would your model interpret that news source as moving to the left because politics has moved to the right?
That's a great question. And we get this related question a lot, which is like, well, how do you account for the Overton window? When people speak about the Overton window, it's this concept of how like politicians change what's acceptable in discourse, and that makes like different political positions or even different statements more acceptable that used to not be acceptable. And it's related, but not exactly the same as the idea that just what is left and right in general shifts over time. If you think about this, like what's left and right in the United States, we have to anchor this on something, because what we mean is it's a U.S. versus like as opposed to international. It's contemporary, which means now and not like 1960 or 2000. And it's based, and we have to anchor it on something because we're trying to measure the bias of the media outlets, the media sources themselves. So we're trying to measure that in comparison to what is left and right in the United States right now at this time. So we anchor it on like the positions of elected officials because it's really squishy. Like you could anchor it on one of three things. You could anchor it on like, you know, how the public feels, which would be polling, which is like a little more squishy. You could anchor on the media, like what the media is saying, but we're trying to measure that, so that's no good. But you could also anchor it on like who is actually in power, our elected officials, and that's easier to measure because you can, in your mind, if I tell you to think of who's the most right-wing member of Congress and who's the most left-wing member of Congress. Like, names will come to mind. Same thing for like who is a median Democrat and who's a median Republican, who is a very centrist Democrat, who's a very centrist Republican. And then you can figure out like the positions they hold, the things they say, like those are characteristic of what's left and right in the United States right now. You can have even media that's like more extreme than those very extreme members of Congress, of course. So like that, what is left and right does shift. I mean, if you think about just same-sex marriage in the United States, like 2010, it was like a hyper-partisan left position to be for a same-sex marriage. Like Obama wasn't even for it. But now it's like sort of like middle, center left. So like it and on immigration, like all these things do shift. So what we found with something like AP is that in our rating system, it really doesn't shift very much. Like what AP, and that's a function of like how they report. Even if, democracy and the rule of law, is in like a very different state today than it was, just last year, they like just by reporting facts about that, they can stay minimally biased. Like we have not seen AP shift rapidly like left or any other sources that are similar like that, like Reuters or Bloomberg or what have you. We do see some shifts, like interesting news sources that are newer, like the Bulwark. Like the Bulwark, it's mostly podcasts and like Substacks and an online site from people who characterize themselves as like conservative on certain issues, but they're very much against Trump. So their writing focuses a lot on being anti-Trump rather than on like conservative issues. So that news source, because of its like strong anti-Trump focus, is just like center left rather than like middle or center right.
It's interesting because what it makes me think of is two things. First of all, we should just mention that there's been all this controversy about Trump wanting the AP out of the White House briefing room, and they've had to sue. I'm sure everybody has followed this in the news that follows this kind of stuff, and I mean, it would, in many respects, to kind of follow up on kind of where Trevor is going. I mean, the AP is not something you would think of as like it's not The Nation or Mother Jones here,
right.
But where we are is it's almost like Trump has decided that if you're telling the truth and that truth is something negative about me, well, then you're just fake left-wing news. To go on a broader point, it seems to me, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, it seems to me what has happened over the years is that if you're just a little over to the left, or you're in the center, or you're just a little over to the right in your media, you keep pushing more to the right. It's almost like these organizations have almost been bullied to move in that direction. There's this sense that, and this has been going on since probably Reagan, this sense of, well, if you're any way left-leaning media, you're anti-American, you're communist, you're a pinko. I mean, I'm exaggerating here a little bit to make a point. I mean, and it's so when this whole conversation about does it have a liberal bias? Is it liberal? You could say yes, but I think things have been pushed. The center is not in the center anymore, I think is what I'm saying. So would you agree with that? And how does that fit in with what you're doing, but not so much about how you explain it?
It's not just the right that's pushing the center. I think the center is being entirely dug out, more probably from the right, but there are plenty of examples of social issues on the left that would not have flown with the center left of decades ago. It,
Right,
as
but that
someone
may
who's
be more of a
fairly
that may
centrist,
be more natural.
It's a tough time.
Yeah, that may be more of a natural evolution, though. It just, in my opinion, where I think that what I'm talking about is more of this sense of it's been pulled, kicking and dragging in that direction because of the bullying
Hmm.
that's gone on. I mean, I agree with what Trevor is saying. I
Hmm.
just think maybe they're not the same. They're done for different reasons, good or bad, either way.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a few factors that go into that. I mean, the term that people will use is audience capture. Your audience wants and expects a certain thing from either the right or the left. And so, as a news organization, especially as the news landscape has changed so much, you have to actively make decisions on like what you should say and do in order to not just like, fulfill your mission on what you set out to provide as information, but like as a business, like how do you survive with like how do you capture subscriptions, readership, advertising dollars? And that's in some news organizations have been trapped in that. Like they haven't made like super clear decisions or even like conscious decisions about that. Because, you see something like the Washington Post, they have for years had like a left-leaning opinion section. And so, they have it's been a long time since they had like a big base of right-leaning subscribers to the Washington Post. So when Jeff Bezos says, we want to limit like our opinion stuff on Trump, and we want to we want to focus our opinion section most on like free market principles and personal freedoms, um, indicating that they were going to step away from being more overtly left-leaning. The readership base was like very upset, and they canceled their subscriptions en masse because like the choice that Washington Post had made over the years is like, all right, we're going our definitely our opinion analysis is going to cater more towards a left-leaning audience, and it's the same with like with Fox as well. So it's you've and we're a very polarized society, so it's saying the center is not the center anymore. I mean, I think we have like this bimodal distribution of folks where like there's big if you think of like a bell curve with like two modes, like one on the left and one on the right, where there's like a peak there. Most people are like a very, strongly, there's a big concentration that are very strongly to the left, a very big concentration is very strongly to the right. And there are folks in the middle. There is like this valley in the middle, but it's very hard for them to stay there. They will definitely, like in the United States, you have to vote for like one side or the other. So you tend to have to like associate with one side or another. I mean, this gets into we're covering like a lot of topics, but like audience capture does make news sources drift further to the left and the right. Because if you want to be there's only room for a handful of successful news organizations that just appeal to the center and everybody very, very broadly. Most, in order to compete, small news outlets like podcasts, tiny blogs, Substacks or whatever, they'll find their niche and they will double down. And those, like, they have even more reason to go towards audience capture. You can have a YouTube channel with 50,000, 100,000, a million followers. And one of the best ways, easiest ways to do that is to like you spew anger and vitriol because you only need like 100,000, a million people, and if it's only like one or two people that's like producing the thing, that can make you plenty of ad dollars. There's a lot of monetary incentive for a small, extreme content production. So that's why there's tens of thousands of those, and it's very difficult business wise to have a you know centrist, broadly appealing, large news organization that employs a lot of journalists very expensively and like attracts all those eyeballs.
And you're listening to WUSB FM 90.1. And I'm Steve Matteo with Trevor Christian, and our guest is Vanessa Otero. She's the founder and CEO of Ad Fontes Media. And, obviously news has evolved a lot. I mean, once cable news sort of got into the game, I think that was a really big change. But of course, over the years, so many other things in terms of online, social media, there's just so much podcasting nowadays. Um, one of the things that seems to me that is really moving things now is after this election, we realized that the social media companies, which are media companies,
Hmm.
they are information delivery platforms,
Hmm.
whatever else you want to call them.
Yep.
And we know they have aligned themselves now with Donald Trump financially, in terms of the way that they are operating. And this may be the biggest change that we've seen in a long time. So would you agree with that, disagree with that? And how do you sort of evaluate a platform that really is not news in a traditional sense? It is just simply a platform. It used to be one thing,
Hmm.
social media.
Hmm.
Now it delivers whatever information, and in some cases can have its own bias without being an editorial entity.
Hmm. I would agree that X has aligned itself with Donald Trump. I mean, really explicitly with Elon Musk. I think it's a more nuanced conversation with Meta, which controls like Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, which are all major social media platforms. They have certainly like relaxed their content moderation efforts, which I think is really unfortunate because you know, I don't think it would be completely fair to say that they've like fully aligned. Meta has aligned itself fully with Trump. But regarding like lack of content moderation, the uh, because they're so responsible for distributing content, I think the responsibility should fall to the those platforms um, to moderate information. They don't have to legally, but they do have the right to. So it's this tricky thing where in the United States we have the First Amendment, like freedom of speech, which limits the government from infringing on speech. But we also have like this broader ethic as Americans that like generally all of our speech should be like very free. And Americans sort of expect large platforms to uphold standards of free speech. Well, platforms are private companies. Like they don't have a First Amendment obligation to allow just any speech that's legal. And they limit it in a lot of ways because they have to, otherwise your platform experience would be terrible. Like they are always moderating like scams and bots and fraud, that kind of stuff, like fake accounts and sexually explicit content, really violent content, like stuff that's legal under the First Amendment. But like if you had that just running rampant across the platform and they didn't moderate it at all, it would be a terrible user experience. Like no one would want to spend any time there. You even see that with X, like less content moderation. There's like more porn, there's more violence, and like, people are just like yucked out by it and they leave. But in the area of like content that's like true or false, the platforms have always had a very hard time and been very like, squishy about trying to regulate that because it's hard to do. It's hard to make a call on like, how true something is. This is something like we deal with every single day because we think it's important, but they've largely like not been very good at it in the first place. And when faced with any political complaints, they're like, well, let's just back away from it completely. So the only law that regulates what these platforms can and cannot do regarding speech is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's a law that was made in the 1990s when online platforms first came on the scene. And there was this big question of like, well, should platforms be liable for the content that a user publishes? Because like if a newspaper is liable for the content that they publish. If you publish something defamatory, like the person can sue the newspaper. But what if a user on a platform publishes something defamatory? The platform is just like hosting the thing. Are they liable for that defamation? And this law, this Section 230 said no, like because if we made them liable, then these companies couldn't exist. So it's actually a very favorable law to these platforms that says you have the right to moderate content, but also you are not forced to moderate content. You're not going to be held liable for anything that's like false or misleading or whatever that's spread on there. And that's turned out to be like not great for society.
Hmm. It seems to me, particularly with Facebook, that in terms of scams and frauds and bots, it's worse than ever. I don't think
Hmm.
I've ever seen it as bad as it is. And it's so blatant. I mean, you don't have to be a person of high intelligence or to be media savvy
Hmm.
to realize it. So,
Hmm.
I don't think that they're really, it's just, to me, it's just gotten worse. But I mean, that's
Hmm.
another topic.
Yeah.
So, where is your organization headed? I mean, what new things do you think you'll be doing, or what do you see about um, how you will be operating going forward, and how will
Hmm.
upcoming midterm elections, presidential elections, in any way affect how you do business or where you might be headed?
You know, we we're really concerned about the business of news. I mean, what we do is, we really appreciate the work of journalists. It's like really fundamental to our democracy. Journalists, like their whole job is to go out and find information that would be difficult for us as individuals to discover on our own otherwise. And we need that. We need reporting on government and on businesses and like what's going on in our communities, local, national news, and so we really value like the high reliability, minimally biased journalism. And our business is very much focused on making sure that those high reliability publishers can flourish. Uh, News outlets have gone through some pretty rough times since you know not just since like websites went digital, but especially since like 2008 with like Google, Google taking over search, and then in the 2010s when you had you have smartphones and social media becoming these main distribution engines, and then like so many like the proliferation of tens of thousands of news sources. The revenues to news outlets have just been on a very steep decline. I think that's really unfortunate. So there's a problem within like the advertising industry itself that in the last 10 years or so, uh, a lot of major advertisers have pulled away from advertising in news whatsoever just because they sort of want to avoid, political conflict or like having their ads showing up to negative content. But it turns out that sort of approach is really harmful, not just to news publishers, but it's harmful to advertisers too. Like there are really like informed, educated, engaged people reading news content. And so our business is really focused on helping advertisers responsibly fund news. So that's what we do as a company in on the business side of things, but we do it so we can continue to rate as much news as possible because everyone just needs this sort of resource. One thing you said earlier about like, saying something that's to the left or to the right is like, or something to the left is like woke and radical and whatever. The way that people talk about news sources that the president talks about anything that he doesn't like, just to characterize it as like very extreme. We all tend to do that. We tend to say like, oh, that one's a little bit right. Like it's so right wing, it's far right wing propaganda. And we are not very careful in how we talk and how we characterize news sources. There's a difference between something that's like maybe a little bit biased, a little bit to the left, and something that's like very extreme left. There's a difference between something that's center right and something that's like right wing, like misleading. Objectively measuring that is important. Like for people to be able to tell exactly how far and how good, okay, or bad something it is that's what we do. So like fundamentally, we like that's why there's a need for our company. That's why people come to our website, and that's why we're going to keep doing what we do.
Have you ever had any media organizations come to you and say, "How could you put us all the way over there, or all the way over there?" Or,
Yeah.
I mean, is this a common thing?
Yeah. And what's helpful is that our ratings are really transparent. Like I've taken lots of calls with the news publishers and said, like, shown them exactly where their articles fall. And like, well, this article, we rated it as, misleading because of this sentence. And it's like we have substantiation for that. So it's hard to argue. And so we've actually had, there are some news outlets that are super left and super right, and like they've got audience capture and they just want us like stay in those corners. They're not going to change. But we also have other news outlets that are like, we don't mean to be all of that extreme. Like we think of ourselves as like respectable. Like we recognize that some of those haven't been up to like the best editorial standards. How can we improve? And that's been very gratifying to me.
Do you get more complaints from the right or the left?
Mm, both.
Hmm.
Yeah, they're of different nature, like the nature of left wing complaints is usually about like purity and like left on left sort of attacks, and then the nature of, so we'll get like some fairly like vicious like name calling from the far left, and then from the right it tends to be more like, well, you're just biased and just like sort of dismissive and you know just saying things that are false. Like the far left and far right are similar in a lot of ways, but they're different in a lot of ways too.
I find it interesting when organizations don't sort of admit who they are, or
Hmm.
or they are one thing sort of with their main media property, and then
Hmm.
they'll do things on social media, particularly with headlines
Oh yeah.
as clickbait
Hmm.
that just
Hmm.
either twists what they are, or actually, this is the scary part, it actually reveals who they really are.
Hmm.
You know, I
Hmm.
mean, I'll just give an example. I find The Hill
Hmm.
pretends to be this very sort of center news organization, but there's a subtlety to their online social media posts, particularly
Hmm.
with their headlines,
Hmm.
that says to me who they are. Let me ask you this too. Speaking of The Hill,
Hmm.
do you look at mastheads in
Hmm.
terms of how that reflects the media bias of an organization? Like if you see a lot of people had worked at NPR and Mother Jones and wherever,
Hmm.
or on the other hand, a lot of people who worked at Fox and Newsmax.
Hmm.
Is that part of your equation or your formula to deciding the
Yeah.
overall bias of a news organization?
No, I mean, we're very strictly focused on content. We're about grading the paper, not the student, because you can tell everything that you need to tell from the words that they write on the page. So, I mean, people ask us, could you characterize a journalist? Like, yeah, we could. Like, if we took the ratings of all the articles from one particular journalist, like they tend to be kind of all in the same area. But that's not always the case, especially when you have people shifting in a coalition like we do in our current politics. So we focus on the content, but getting back to the Hill, that's like a tricky one. There's two things in play. The Hill in particular, on their social media content and in their headlines, will tend to do this format where they quote tweet somebody. They just quote a far right or like a right-leaning or a left-leaning politician. It's like quote, 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 Trump says. And it was like a very right-leaning thing. Or like, quote, 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 Chuck Schumer says. And it was a very like left-leaning thing. And so when you put that first, like when you put the quote of the politician first, you're platforming it. And so you can use an argument like, oh, well, we're just showing what they said. But the purpose of using a quote is on this gradient of like, well, on one hand, we're just showing what they said, and on the other hand, we're just platforming it like this is correct. And so it's usually somewhere in between, and it often lands like they're just platforming it. Um, and so the Hill is like pretty much right in the middle because they will sort of do this um, equally on the right and the left. People have a really hard time pegging exactly where they are. And then, but the other trick that a lot of news outlets do, which is unfortunate, authors will say, "Well, I didn't write the headline. My editor did." I don't think that's a great practice. I think the author should be responsible for the headline,
Yep.
and so usually like the headline's worse worse than the article, and then the tweet is worse than the headline.
I'll just ask one question. Um, is there any third access to rate these news organizations by to sort of create a slightly more complicated picture? One thing I'm just, scrolling through and seeing things like the Bulwark and TMZ next to each other. Those are extremely different news
Hmm.
organizations, and the fact
Hmm.
that they show up right next to each other on the page makes me wonder, maybe we should discuss something like civic mindedness of issues discussed, or I guess seriousness, uh, to put it another way. And is there a way of, I guess, taking taking like quality opinion and putting it in maybe a different level than something more along the lines of untrue information?
You
Because
know,
I think
yeah.
I see some of the opinion stuff may be more rated that way because it's so nakedly opinion, and some of it
Mhm.
may be more rated, more lowly rated because it's just not as high quality.
Yeah, there's we've had a lot of suggestions for third axes over the years. I mean, it's logistically very difficult to implement, but one thing to keep in mind is that like a two-dimensional axis, we try to accommodate a lot of nuance, but it's inherently going to be limited. When we want to discuss the differences between a TMZ and a bulwark, we got to talk about the differences between TMZ and a bulwark. But to convey the idea of like over like we want to be able to meet people wherever they're at with this infographic. So if they see it for the first time and like they've never even really thought about media bias, just like the framework, like, oh, some stuff is better, okay, and worse. Some's left and right, some's further out there. Like that's all they might the that's the depth to which they might think about it. Others will just like go down the rabbit hole on our whole methodology white paper and like get into these very esoteric discussions. So we want to provide space for all of that. So within the limitations of a two-dimensional chart, different news sources can be in the same area. Uh, very different types of news sources can be in the same area of the chart for different reasons. But overall, we do feel like it's you know, reasonable for something like the bulwark to be like in the middle, like opinionish section of the chart, because the axis is reliability. How much can you rely on this news source to be thoroughly and factfully informed about things that are important to you and your community? Like that's our definition. How much can you rely on this? And so how much can you rely on somebody that's like putting out just all political opinion? It's like, well, like it's not untrue. There's like lots of stuff that's in there, but like you're not going to get, it's not you're not going to be as informed as if you read like AP or The Economist. It's just like a different type of information source. But like how similar in reliability are the Bulwark and TMZ? Well, TMZ does a lot of really good in like breaking news on entertainment. Like they publish a lot of tabloid junk too, and some of the stuff that's like not quite up to journalistic standards, but they do have a lot of like breaking entertainment news. So like what's more, reliable? Like they're similarly reliable for different things.
Mm. I feel like we have a lot to talk about, but we're going to wrap this up. I think we're going to have you back. I think it would be great to have you back, you know, as we get
We've got
closer to the
5 more
midterms.
episodes to go. Come on. We've got
But
5 more
well, for
episodes
you,
before I'm
maybe
off
for
the
you,
rails.
Trevor.
You can have her
But
back on
okay,
another show.
you may be
No,
back
I don't want to
sooner
take
than
up
you
all
absolutely
that
think.
time.
fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Trevor is going to be moving on soon, but I'm going to stay around, and I think Trevor will be back sooner than he thinks. Our guest today has been Vanessa Otero. and she is the founder and CEO of Ad Fontes Media. This has really been wonderful. Thank you very much for your time. I hope people really think about media. I hope that this conversation makes people think about it in a more unbiased way, or a more sort of, a rounded way, and go to your website and you can download one of these charts for free and you can really see what the organization is about. And I think that, where everybody's screaming from one side or another, here you are, one of the only people trying to say, let's look at this and let's try to understand it. So
Well,
I think that's great.
there's more of us than you think. So
All right.
my pleasure. Thank you for
All
having me.
right. Thank you very much. This is Steve Matteo, Trevor Christian, WUSB 90.1 FM, and we'll see you next time.